Hey everyone, we are on to our next part of the progressive era. Today we're going to focus on political reforms. We already talked about economic reforms, and so we are covering the same standards as before, but we're moving on to a different part of these standards. And so the things that we are going to talk about today, we're going to talk about the suffrage movement, which is the right for women to vote. We're also going to talk about some constitutional amendments, changes to laws, and changes to our democratic process that come about as a result of the progressive movement. Some of the associations that come about and what they're fighting for, as well as the ballot initiative, recalls, and referendums, and what those are specifically and how they do change the democratic process in this country. And we'll talk about a few other political reforms as well. So the essential question that I want you to answer is explain why progressives wanted the political reforms during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And number two, I want you to identify, explain two ways in which progressives brought about change to the American government. And I want you to make sure you use examples, specific examples. So just don't answer the question with a general statement, use specific examples and explain why those examples show how they brought about change to the American government. Some basic context of kind of what's going on in the progressive era. It really is a big grassroots movement. It's not a united movement. There are a lot of different organizations and groups that are fighting for different things. And sometimes those things didn't always coincide with each other of what they truly wanted. However, they are looking at problems that exist in society, some of which have been exposed by the investigative journalists, the muckrakers, and they are going to continue to fight for those things to make things better. And when it comes to government, they want to make government more honest, more efficient, and more democratic. They want the government to serve the interests of the American people as a whole, rather than those who are the wealthy and powerful as they saw it. And so this is something that they are going to fight for. Some of the things we'll talk about in the course of class today. While their success can be measured in different ways, we will talk about in another class period where they fail to kind of include and who they fail to include as well as part of these movements that existed during this time period. So we're going to talk about some of the early reform movements, and these are part of the progressive movement, but they're kind of right on the early edge of the progressive movement as a whole, as we typically cover as far as a time period goes. So in 1883, there was an important law that called the Pendleton Act that came about out of tragedy. James Garfield, the president of the United States, was assassinated, and people were not sure why he was and who killed him, but a lot of people suspected that it was because of an old system of how government jobs were filled. It was called the spoils system. This was first used by Andrew Jackson back in the early or the 1820s and 1830s. Essentially, he would fill jobs with people who were loyal supporters of him. So he'd basically get his friends, people who gave money to his campaign, and he would give jobs, government jobs, to them, kind of as a return favor for supporting him and continue to support him. The spoils system was not something that sat well with many Americans because what they saw was a corrupt system of you scratch my back, I scratch yours. But one of these individuals, who he had employed, had shot him, and so people use this as a reason we need to change how we fill government jobs. It can't be based off of the spoils system. It has to be based off of merit. And so the Pendleton Act, which does, is it basically creates this panel, and when you are being hired for a federal job, they need to hire you based off merit. So how qualified are you to do that job? If you're going to fill the role of somebody who is going to be, say, the Surgeon General, which is kind of our top doctor in our country, that person should be a very well qualified leading medical expert in their field to fill that job. And so this is important because it goes back to that idea. What do the progressives want? The progressives want to have a government that's more efficient. How do you make it more efficient? You put people who are good at their job in positions of power. And so then you can make a government that works better. There's also the populist movement that comes about, and this is something that we cover in AP US history in much more detail than what I'm going to give you. But it's a really important part of, political parties and things that they fight for end up finding their way into our American system of government, even though they themselves are never elected to a major office post in the federal government itself. But it was a grassroots movement that was mostly made up of Western farmers. And so Western farmers really were taking the short end of the stick when it came to things like railroad fees. They depended on the railroads to be able to take their crops to market, and they were being price gouged by the railroad companies. So one of the things they wanted to see was the government come and control the railroads, take it away from the private businesses and these monopolies that were controlling them, and run them and offer fair wages to the American farmers, American people as a whole. Some other things that they fought for was the progressive tax system. And this was the idea of taxing income that was based off of, how much income you were getting. To long story short, on the progressive tax, essentially the more money you make, the higher percentage of tax that you make. So it puts the burden of taxes on the wealthy rather than the poor. Other types of tax systems, we have a flat tax. Everyone pays 15% of their income. Well, that hurts a person more so. 15% taxes. If you were a millionaire, 15% of it is a lot more money, yes, but then at the end you have a lot more money in the end. For somebody who's making, say, under $20,000 a year, or say $20,000 easy, 15% of their taxes, they don't have to pay as much in taxes total, but it's certainly a heavier burden for them to be able to do that than it would be someone who's super wealthy. And so that's something they do fight for. And is one of the things that does kind of end up becoming true or part of our system of government and our tax code today. They fought for public land protections, which is something we'll talk about a little bit more later on. They fought for greenbacks, which was the idea of paper money, which would be backed by silver. And this was a shift from what happened before, because in 1870s, they adopted what's called the gold standard, which they saw as like the crime of the century, because the gold standard, if all our money is backed by gold, there is a much less supply of gold in the world than there is silver. So that limited the number or the amount of money that was being circulated. Much of that ended up into the hands of the super wealthy, which left, your average American working class and farmer with much less money to have. And it also affected inflation as well. So, they were calling for something of what's called the free silver movement, to have our money and our paperbacks, our greenbacks, paper money, be backed by silver, because there was much more of it. There was large quantities and deposits of it in the West that was being mined. And so that would hopefully create more money to be circulated around our economy and to get to the American working people and the farmers. Something that never really happened. If you've ever seen The Wizard of Oz, not the movie, but the book story that created the movie, a lot of people argue that that is an allegory for the populist movement itself, even though it's not written to be. Instead of an emerald city, it's a silver city. And so it's kind of like trying to support the idea that there was that was part of the populist movement itself. But many of you probably have no concern with that. It's just something we talk about in AP. But it is important. It is important in the sense of, one of the things that comes about indirectly, but because of the populist movement, was the 16th Amendment, which the 16th Amendment establishes the income tax, that government can tax your income. And, this comes out of that concern because of the unequal distribution of wealth in the country during this time. And so the 16th Amendment comes about. It's why you have to pay income tax. Well, for most of you who are probably watching this video, you won't have to pay it because you're all dependents. But at some point, you will have to pay taxes on your income. And that's because of the 16th Amendment. And that money gets taken by the government to use for various number of things. It's major shift in government, because then government starts to use that money to focus on providing social programs. And that's something that will continue to build and build and build over time. Very different from the laissez-faire system of government that had been existing prior to this era. So today we do have a progressive tax income. So the more money you do make, the higher percentage you do pay in taxes. And that has been something that's been around for quite a long time. And it's always a sticking point. Every political election that comes around, like the one we currently are in, taxation. How do we tax people? Do we tax the wealthy more? Do we tax everyone more or less? It's always an issue for every political election. So the next thing I want to shift to is some of the things that happen on the state level. So there are some major changes that happen in the federal government, but more of the progressive era initiatives end up happening more at the state and local level instead. And so state and local governments became breeding grounds for corruption, bribery, backdoor deals. We talked about the political machines and the political machines that came about because there really wasn't a whole lot of oversight for what's going on in those cities and so forth. So because of some of these scandals and things that are going on at the local and state levels, progressives are fighting for a way to democratize them and give the people more of a chance and a say of what goes on at the state and local levels. So these are really important because they are directly tied to our standard. And I promise you that you will need to know these for any test that I give relating to the progressives and these standards. The first one is the initiative process, okay? And this was something that it happens at the state level. It doesn't happen at the federal level. All of these happen at the state level, okay? So the initiative process basically allows citizens to propose new laws. And you basically, if you can petition the people and get enough people to sign the petition, then it will be put onto the electoral ballot. And so when the election comes in November and people are voting, they're voting for president, senators, representatives, local officials, whatever, but also for individual laws. And so this allows people to create individual laws and put it on the books without having to depend on the state legislature and the lawmakers at the state. An example of that probably some of you will kind of remember is what happens in Colorado back in, I don't remember which year, but the initiative process to legalize marijuana is, started with an initiative process. And then the people got it onto the ballot, the people voted, and they voted ultimately to legalize marijuana in the state of Colorado, and other states will follow in the same way. But outside of that, there's a lot of laws that come up on the books through the initiative process. But in recent history, and as far as controversial laws, that one definitely stands out, right? So the next one's a referendum, and this allows citizens to petition and vote a law that's being considered for adoption by the state legislation. And when these happen, so sometimes state legislatures will propose a law and then they just get hung up in the legislature. They never get discussed. They die in committee, whatever. But at any time, if it's ever brought up in the state legislature and enough people decide, you know what, they don't want to touch this, but we want this thing, we can start a petition, get it on the ballot, very similar to the initiative process, and have the people vote directly rather than the legislature. And so that is something that, it comes about. In recently, like the state of Pennsylvania, they went through a referendum process to try to end the gerrymandering, which is the drawing of districts to try to make it more fair for both political parties. That's something that did happen as a result of a referendum. The recall, which is another thing, allows voters to remove an official from office before the end of the term. It happens. It's rare. The most kind of recent recall that was kind of a major one outside of just like a judge or a state senator or something like that, it was in California back in 2003. I remember this because I was in college, and you'll probably, after I tell the story, you'll probably remember why I remember or know why I remembered it. But the governor of California, a guy named Gray Davis, got caught up in a scandal. And so the people of California ultimately voted to recall him before the end of his term, which led to a special election, which led to the person getting elected, the governor of California, was Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor, right? So this is how he ended up becoming the governor of California. First started with the recall of the governor of California, who was Gray Davis. And so, he was made president of California. So moving on, and never asked me to do Arnold Schwarzenegger voice again. So direct primary. This is another one of those initiatives. When choosing candidates for political parties, The previous way of doing it was that the party bosses and the people who were party officials would essentially elect the candidates or choose the candidates who they wanted to run for public office. Of course, when you talk about that and you look at like the political machines and the party bosses, it's clearly a corrupt system. And so people wanted to democratize how we choose our candidates. So today we have direct primaries. And so people who are registered with a political party are allowed to vote for the candidates they want to run for offices such as the president. And so the primary votes that just recently happened earlier this year, eventually enough people chose the Democratic candidate of Joe Biden. But there were a lot of people running. Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, there was a lot, okay? And so they narrowed down the field. Eventually, they landed on Joe Biden, who they want to run against President Trump in the upcoming election. Without the direct primary, who knows who would have been the candidate? But this gives the people an opportunity to choose who they think will be the best president or best candidate for that party to represent what that party is, platform and the policies they want to pursue and so forth. So the 17th Amendment is something that does kind of affect the states as well. And I kind of lump it in with state reforms, but it is a federal, it's a constitutional amendment, so it affects the federal government primarily. And the 17th Amendment comes about because we talked about how the state legislatures were kind of seen as corrupt and adherent to the big businesses themselves. And they, originally, when we chose senators, because every state, regardless of the population, they get 2 senators, which means we have 100 in total today. And so the 17th Amendment was created because of the lack of trust in the state legislatures to choose a senator that represents the people of that state, because of all the corruption that they saw in local and state governments. So the 17th Amendment basically gives the people the direct vote to be able to choose their senators. And that wasn't always the case, but it is still today. In our state of Utah, we have 2 senators, Mike Lee and Mitt Romney, both of which were directly elected by the people rather than chosen by a state legislature to be the senators. And so that is a change in our system of government. A major change is debatable, but it certainly it goes back to that whole idea of what progressives want to do. They wanted to democratize. They wanted to give the power of government more to the people. And this was one way they did it. This is something I lump in with the political reforms because it does involve government protection of lands, but conservation. And this is something that comes about because of the fear that with industrialization, you see more mining, you see more lumberjacking or timber industries, you see more use of the land to get raw materials for industrial factories and so forth. And so this whole conservation movement is championed by a guy named John Muir. He's known as the father of the national parks. He's a naturalist and a zoologist. The guy is very in tune with nature. He understands the importance of preserving land, protecting wildlife and everything. And so he champions this. And in Teddy Roosevelt, the president of the United States, who was a very enthusiastic outdoorsman. He goes hunting. He kind of is big a horseback rider. Things like that. He loves the outdoors, and he too sees the need to protect lands from industries from coming in stripping out the entirety of the iron ore, any raw materials or resources in one generation. So he kind of initiates the conservation movement, which kind of gives federal control to much of the lands, especially in the West. As you can see in the map here at the lower right hand of your screen, most of that land is all that land in red is controlled by the federal government. Either it's a national park, or it's controlled by the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife, whatever. It is federally protected land. And it doesn't mean that like companies can't come and drill on that land or mine on that land and such, but it's managed by the government so that, they only take so much at a time. So we do not use all up our natural resources within 1 or 2 generations and sustain our industrial growth over time. So it's a smart way of kind of managing land. It is controversial, and it's not very well liked by some of our representatives in Utah government, and you can probably tell why, because look at all that red in Utah. That is land that private businesses can't use without the permission of the government, and some will argue that it does stifle our economic growth as a state, as does Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Wyoming to some extent, even though there's not enough people there really, Idaho. They all argue that this federal control does kind of stifle their growth. But the purpose of it was to make sure that it wasn't all used in 1 generation, 2 generations, and also to protect the splendor of our wilderness, especially in the West. I mean, it's not just the West, but, we have a lot of beautiful places to go to. And for me personally, and I know like, especially with Skyline having such like enthusiastic outdoors, people with biking and skiing, all that, you want to protect some of these natural places as much as you can, and wildlife. And that's comes with the progressive era, so that we do protect that. And so we have lots of national parks in our country today that are protected land that isn't be allowed to use for any kind of stripping of natural resources, but to protect that splendor. And so here's our map of the national parks of the United States. A lifetime goal of mine has been to try to visit as many of these, if not all of these, at some point in my life. I don't think I'll get there, but it is, if you've been to any of them, I mean, Yellowstone, absolutely gorgeous, right? Utah has quite a few national parks in our state. I can honestly say that our great state of Utah is so beautiful that the entirety of our state could become a national park, honestly. But yeah, that is a important part of the movement of the progressives as well, is to preserve for the government to preserve the lands of our country. So the next one we're going to get into, and this is where your assignment is going to be directly tied to, is the women's suffrage movement. And so women's suffrage, which means the women's right to vote, women were, it's never mentioned in the Constitution in the beginning of the Constitution once written, as who is and who isn't allowed to vote. It was kind of a general understanding that women were essentially represented by their husbands, and the husbands would do the voting. It wasn't always true. In 1807, or so, in New Jersey, from the time of the ratification of the Constitution in 1789 to 1807, women in New Jersey had the right to vote, but the law restricted that in 1807, which stopped the women's right to vote and so forth. And from there, there's going to be a fight continuing to try to get women the right to vote as citizens of the United States, equal citizens in the United States, right? So I'm starting my timeline here in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. This is the first women's rights convention that was led by a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is the kind of leader and champion of the women's rights movement. It is, in the video that I give you to background knowledge, definitely talks a little more about her and so forth. But from the convention itself, they write what's known as the Declaration of Sentiments. And it mirrors much of what the Declaration of Independence is. It calls for equal rights for women, including the right to vote, the right to property, the right to have equal wages, the right to be able to divorce, which was not a right that was extended to women. It was only extended to men. And so, these things, there's more, but these are some things that they're fighting for itself. But we're going to focus mainly on suffrage today because, many of these equal rights that they already talked about in 1848 are still being fought for today. So in 1869, Wyoming is the first state, which was more of a territory at the time, but, becomes a state because of this, is the first state to give women the right to vote. The entirety of the whole women's suffrage movement was more of a west to east movement, meaning that more states in the West were giving women the right to vote, where in the states in the East were not. And so it won't be until there's a national amendment that affects the women's right to vote that some states eventually give women the right to vote. So it's a west to east thing. 1870, the 15th Amendment, which was ratified to give African Americans the right to vote, and then we're talking about African American men. In that amendment, it was fought for that it would extend the right to vote not just to African Americans, but also to women as well. And it did not work out. Even some of the big supporters of the 15th Amendment and African American rights, like Frederick Douglass, even he said that if we give women the right to vote with this too, then it runs the risk of not being passed or ratified, because some people will say it's too much too fast. They do not want to necessarily give more people the right to vote right away. And there's lots of reasons behind that. Some of the things that we will not be able to get to discussion with in class because it's more of a survey course. But that doesn't stop Susan B. Anthony in 1872. In protest of the fact that the 15th Amendment did not extend the rights to the women the vote, she is going to be arrested for illegally voting, something of which she was just pardoned of in this last year by President Trump, even though she's been dead for a very, very long time. But she voted illegally as a means to try to kind of bring attention to that issue. And she does grandstand and give speeches about the women's right to vote and the need for them to vote as citizens of the country during her trial. And so this brings more attention to the issue. In 1878, the Women's Suffrage Amendment was proposed in Congress, but it dies in the Senate. And so it's mentioned it because it's the first time where the idea of a constitutional amendment that extends women's the right to vote starts in 1878. In 1896, state of Utah gives universal suffrage to women. So again, more states, and there's a lot I didn't mention here, but more states in the West are giving the right to vote to women more than we are as a national unified state. 1912, the first political party supports women's right to vote, and that was Teddy Roosevelt when he ran as a third-party candidate under the Bull Moose Party. He makes a point to, as part of his campaign, that he would support a suffrage amendment. In 1917, the United States goes to war in World War I. And women, this is really, I mention this because this is really kind of the tipping point for a lot of people's public opinion about women's right to vote, because many of the women, seeing how many men end up getting into the military and going off to Europe to fight, women come into their own by kind of, or come into, how do their own? They come into replace those jobs in the factories and help make munitions and other war supplies that were necessary for us to help fight and win the war. And that is kind of the big thing that really turns people's public opinion for the right to vote. If they can make bullets, if they can do these things, if they can play a huge role in us winning the war, why should they not have the right to vote? So that is something that does change the tide of the whole suffrage movement. On top of that, Alice Paul, who's one of my favorite suffragettes, right? She is going to be kind of very in your face about the whole thing. And even during a time of war where it was a very much of a taboo to criticize your government, criticize the president during times of war, she goes with some supporters to the gates of the White House and protesting him. Some of the signs even refer to him as Kaiser Wilson, which Kaiser was the term of the leader of the German nation, which we were fighting against. So, I mean, this is like very controversial stuff this time. She ends up getting arrested for protesting because there were laws that we'll talk about when we talk about World War I that made it illegal for you to speak out against your government or speak out against the war effort of the government. And so she's arrested. She's put in jail, her and her supporters, and they're tortured. They are force-fed. They do a hunger strike in there, so they're force-feeding them. They're torturing them. They're trying to break their will. And rather than breaking their will, they end up getting more sympathy from the American public because newspaper stories are talking about what's going on to them in prison. And everyone's like, whoa, that is not okay. And so they end up bringing more attention and more public pressure onto the president to bring about a change in the in our system and give women the right to vote. So in 1918, President Wilson supports the passing of an amendment after the war is over. And by 1920, 19th Amendment is ratified. The 19th Amendment itself, passed in 1920, extends, so hey, just going back, 1878, 1920, it takes about roughly 41 years for the 19th Amendment to pass into law. And it extends the right to vote to women. And it is going to be a pretty important moment in democracy and history. And it kind of fulfills one of the major goals of the progressives, which is to expand voter rights, democratize, get more people involved. And the more voters that you have voting for things, then the less likelihood of political machines, big businesses, corrupt governments are influenced by that. And the government becomes a government by the people and for the people. And that really, truly was one of the major goals of the progressive movement. So finish your essential questions. The assignment that you're going to be doing is tied with this on Canvas about the women's suffrage movement a little bit more. I have a video that gives you some background with some primary sources and such to answer questions for. So with that being said, I hope everyone's doing all right, and I will see you later.